Again, welcome to the Anatomy and Histology course. Today we will talk about the bone tissue and the skeletal system. As usual, we will start with the chapter objective, which we have to know that after this chapter, you will be able to list and describe the function of bone, describe the classes of bones, discuss the process of bone formation and development, explain how the bone repairs itself after the fracture, and discuss the effect of exercise and nutrition and hormone on the bone tissue. Therefore, for this purpose, we have 6 sections. The first section is the function of the skeletal system. The second section is the bone classification. The third section is the bone structure. The fourth section is the bone formation and development. And the fifth is the fracture, bone repair. And the sixth section, exercise, nutrition, hormone, and bone tissue. Let's start with section number 1. Now, what is the function of the skeletal system? First of all, what is the skeletal system? It is the body system that composed of bone and cartilage and other structure like ligament, tendon, and all these things. And the skeletal system perform very critical function for the human body. Now, first of all, the bone, the definition of the bone, it's the osseous tissue, which is a hard, dense connective tissue that forms most of the adult skeleton, whereas the cartilage is a semi-rigid of connective tissue and provide the flexibility and smooth surfaces for the movement and the joint. Now, the major function of the skeletal system could be categorized into 5 major functions. First of all, it's providing us the supporting, and it facilitates the movement and protect the internal organs such as the brain, protected by the skull, the spinal cord protected by vertebral column, heart and lungs protected by the rib cage. The next function, which is the producing the blood cell, this process called hematopoiesis, and it's carrying out in what is called red bone marrow, which we talk in detail later. And the fifth function, which is storing and releasing the minerals and storing the fat, which also carried out by the yellow bone marrow, which we talk in detail later. ملخص سريع للسكيلتال سيستم هو السيستم المكون من البون والكارتلج والليجامنت، وله 5 وظائف رئيسية، من أهمها دعم الجسم وتسهيل الحركة، حماية الأعضاء الداخلية، إنتاج كريات الدم بكافة أنواعها، وهذا بيتم عن طريق الريد بون مارو ونحكي عنه بالتفصيل، وتخزين المعادن وخصوصا الفات، وهذا بيتم عن طريق اليلو بون مارو. وزي ما حكينا إنه البون هو الهارد connective tissue والكارتلج هو الغضروف. Now for next section we will talk about bone classification. Now our adult skeleton composed of 206 bones. Now these 206 bones can be divided into 5 categories based on their shape. Now we have 5 shapes, which are the long bone, short bone, flat bone, irregular bone, and the sesamoid bone. Now let's start with the long bone. The long bone is the one that is cylindrical in shape, in which its length larger than its width. Now, however, this term describes the shape of the bone, not its size, and we will talk how it comes like this. Now, the long bone are found in the arm, like humerus and ulna and radius, could be found in the leg, in the femur, tibia, and fibula, as well as in the finger, like metacarpal phalanges, and in toes, metatarsal and phalanges. And we have to know that the long bone functioning as a lever system. they move when the muscle is contracted. Now the second type is short bone, which is a cube-like shape, approximately equal in all dimensions. And the only short bone we have could be found at the carpal bone in the wrist and tarsal bones at the ankle. And they provided stability, and they are limited in their range of motion. Flat bone are, from its name, it's thin and curved, and we could find the flat bone in the skull, like the cranium, which means the skull. We could find it in the ribs, in the scapula, and in the sternum. Flat bone is very optimistic bone to provide attachment site for muscle and tendon, plus its role in protecting the internal organ. Irregular bone is called irregular because it couldn't be categorized under long or short or flat. It's complex in shape, and the major two irregular bone could be found at the vertebra, which building up the vertebral column, and the facial bone, and mainly they provide an attachment site for the muscle and tendon and protecting the internal organ. The sesamoid bone, from its name, it's a sesame seed. It's a small or moderate large round bone founded at the tendon attachment site, and it's mainly to protect the tendon from the friction force and the compressive forces. The major and the most common sesamoid bone is the patella. بملخص عندنا جهازنا الهيكلي مبني من 206 عظمات، ممكن تقسيمهم إلى 5 مجموعات بناء على الشكل. ففي عندنا اللونج والشورت والفلات والريجولار والسيسامويد. اللونج طولها أكبر من عرضها، وممكن تكون صغيرة زي الفالنجز، ممكن تكون كبيرة زي الفيمر. طبعا تشتغل على مبدأ إيش؟ إنها تساعد في الموفمنت. الشورت فهي متساوية الأبعاد، عندنا نوعين فقط، الكارب الموجودة عظام الرسغ، والتارسل عظام الكاحل، وهي مسؤولة عن توفير الاستابيليتي وتعطينا محدودية حركة. الفلات هي زي الصحن، أشبه زي الصحن أو thin and curved، وموجودة زي السكال والضلوع والسكابلة، عظمة اللوح في الشولدر، وهي أنسب نوع أو شكل توفر أماكن اتصال للعضلات والأوتار. الإريجولار لأنها اسمها إريجولار ما نقدر نصنفها تحت هذول الأصناف، وأكثر مثال عليها عظمة فقرة العمود الفقري وعظام الوجه. والسيسامويد هي عضلة بيضاوية يعني أشبه بحبة السمسم، وهي ناعمة وموجودة في أماكن تواجد التندون لتحميه من الفريكشن فورس، قوة الاحتكاك، وأكبر مثال عليها صابونة الركبة. Now here an example of the flat bone and the irregular bone, short bone, sesamoid and long bone. Now let's talk about the bone structure. Under the bone structure we have to talk about the gross anatomy of bone, then we will go to the bone marking, then we will go to the bone cells and tissue. 3 titles. Now this is the typical long bone showing here, showing the gross anatomical characteristic of bone. In general, the long bone has 2 parts, diaphysis and epiphysis. The metaphysis is a part of the epiphysis. تمام? Now, in general, so we have to know that the bone part we have diaphysis and epiphysis. Metaphysis is a part of epiphysis. In terms of bone marrow, we have to understand the red bone marrow, which mainly located in the epiphysis and responsible for production the red blood cell. And we have the yellow bone marrow, which mainly founded at the diaphysis in a cavity called medullary cavity, and responsible to storing and releasing mineral and storing the fat. Also, we have to know that we have bone tissue, 2 types of bone tissue. We have compact bone, which is the outer surface, and the spongy bone, and the compact bone is very hard and compose the outer surface, and the spongy bone it is inside and it is trabeculated يعني فراغي network-like structure and hosting the red bone marrow. And in terms of bone layer, we have two layers: the periosteum, which covering the whole. This is the most outermost layer of the bone, periosteum, which covering the compact tissue, and we have the endosteum, which covering the inner side of the bone. Periosteum hosting the blood vessels, nerve, and lymph. So, another things we have to know that we have here epiphyseal line. Epiphyseal line originally before the age of 18, epiphyseal line was epiphyseal plate, and it was a cartilage tissue. However, at the age of 18, this cartilage become ossified and become to called epiphyseal line. بملخص سريع، إذا أخذنا العظمة أجزاء العظم الرئيسية هي الديافيسيس والإبافيسيس. الميتافيسيس هو جزء من الإبافيسيس. هسا إذا أخذنا من ناحية نخاع العظم وهو البون مارو، في عنا نوعين: في عنا الريد بون مارو وهو المسؤول عن إنتاج خلايا الدم وموجود في الإبافيسيس، وعنا اليلو بون مارو عادة بنلاقيه في الديافيسيس ومسؤول عن تخزين المعادن والفات. من ناحية البون تيشيو عندنا كومباكت وسبونجي. الكومباكت وهو الأوتر سيرفيس of the البون وهو الغطاء الخارجي للعظمة وهو صلب، والسبونجي هو فراغي مليء بالفراغات وعلى شكل شبكة وخفيف وبخزن الريد بون مارو. من ناحية اللايرز يعني الطبقات، في عنا البريوستيوم اللي هي الطبقة الخارجية واللي هي بتغطي الكومباكت بون، وعنا الاندوستيوم هي الطبقة الداخلية. In terms of bone marking, there are three general classes of bone marking. We have articulation, we have a projection, and we have holes. Now, the articulation is where the two bone surfaces come together, articulus, which means joint. Now, these surfaces tend to conform to one another, such as one being rounded and the other cut, to facilitate the function of the articulation. Under this category, we could find the three terminology: head, which is a rounded surface; facet, flat surface; condyle, rounded and smooth surfaces. Now, in terms of the projection is an area of a bone that projects above the surface of the bone. These are the attachment points for the tendon and the ligament. And here we could find several terminology: protuberance, which means protruding; process, prominence, features; spine, sharp process; tubercle is more rounded process; tuberosity is a rough surface; and the line, slight, elongated ridge; crest, it's a ridge. Now, in terms of the hole, which is a hole and depression, opening and depression. So the hole is an opening or a groove in the bone that allows the blood vessel and nerve to enter the body. And here we have different terminology. We have fossa, which is like elongated basin, or like a dish. And we have the fova, smaller bits. Sulcus is a groove. If the sulcus become too deep, we call it a fissure. We have a canal, which has passage in the bone, and the opening of this canal is called meatus. And we have the foramen, which is a regular hole, and the sinus, which is air-filled space in the bone. ملخص سريع: البون ماركينج هي البروزات العظمية، وعندنا وهي الشكل مش الشكل بقدر ما إنه العظمة في إلها نتوءات نتوءات داخلية، فممكن نصنفها على شكل articulation وهي نهايات العظم اللي بتشكل المفاصل، projection وهي نتوءات عظمية على سطح العظمة، والهولز هي عبارة عن فتحات وأخديد. وتحت كل نوع 3 عدة مصطلحات لابد إنك إيش تعرفها. طبعا this is another table that providing more clarification example of the bone marking that could helping you to understanding them. Now, in terms of bone cells and tissue, let's starting with the bone cells. Now, we have 4 types of cells could be found within the bone tissue. Now, they are the osteogenic cells and the osteoblast, osteocyte, and osteoclast. Starting with the osteogenic cell. Now, osteogenic cells are undifferentiated cell and they called stem cell. يعني خلايا ما تطورت. Could be developed for whatever cells you want. But however, in our case, the osteogenic cells developed to become an osteoblast. Blast means forming, developing. So osteoblast is responsible for developing and growth of the bone and formation of the bone. Now, once the osteoblast become in contact with the calcium and phosphorus, it become osteocyte. Cyte means cell, which is a mature bone cell. On the other hand, we have another type of bone cells called osteoclast. Clast means resorption and breaking down. This cell is responsible to removing the dead bone tissue and modeling and shaping the bone surface. بشكل بسيط عندنا 4 أنواع من الخلايا العظمية. أوستوجينيك وهي القابلة على أنها تتطور لأي نوع من أنواع الخلايا. تتطور للأوستيوبلاست اللي هي بتنتج العظم اللي المسؤولة عن إنتاج وإفراز ونمو العظم. طبعا الأوستيوبلاست إذا اتحدت مع الكالسيوم والفوسفور تصير خلية عظمية ناضجة أوستيوسايت. الأوستيوكلاست مسؤولة على التخلص من خلايا العظمية الميتة وتشكيل أسطح العظم. Now, in terms of bone tissue, we have 2 types of bone tissue, as we said before. We have the compact bone and we have the spongy bone. This compact bone, it's building from osteum, which is the basic unit structure of the compact bone. It is a hard, dense connective tissue that can tolerate and counter the compressive and mechanical forces. Now, the spongy bone, it is the inner, in the inside or inward, and it is trabeculated, which means network-like structure filled with many spaces, and it's responsible to hosting the red bone marrow, which is responsible for الريد أو البلاد سيل برودكشن. يعني إذا إحنا بنشوف إنه عندنا نوعين من العظم، عندنا الكومباكت وهو الصلب، وعندنا السبونجي وهو الخفيف. طبعا الصلب لتوفير القوة، والخفيف اللي بيعمل على توزيع الحمل، بالإضافة إلى إنه بيحتوي على الريد بون مارو لإنتاج خلايا الدم. And we have also to know that the blood vessel and nerve enter the bones through the nutrient foramina to nourish and innervate the bone. By this, we completed the section number 3, and let's jump to the section number 4, which is the bone formation and development. Now, the process by which the bone development is called osteogenesis or ossification. And we have to know that we have 2 pathways, osteogenic pathway. The intramembranous ossification, and the second is the endocondural ossification. Intramembranous ossification, it's the process by which the mesenchymal cell develop directly to become bone. And the endocondural ossification is the process by which the mesenchymal cell develop to become cartilage, then the cartilage develop to become a bone. Now, we have 2 processes of bone growth. The first is called epiphyseal plate, responsible for the bone to grow in length, and the modeling allowing the bone to grow in diameter. بشكل سريع إن عملية إنتاج العظم بنسميها osteogenesis أو ossification، وعندنا نوعين أو عندنا طريقتين في إنتاج العظم. إما طريقة مباشرة بنسميها intramembranous ossification، بحيث تتحول الميسنكايمال سيل إلى عظم بشكل مباشر، في حين إنه الاندوكوندورال اوسيفيكيشن هي عملية بتحول فيها الميزنكايمال سيل لخلايا غضروفية كارتلج، وبعدين من كارتلج تتحول لإيش؟ إلى بون. طبعا في عنا عمليتين لنمو العظم، الإبيفيزال بليت مسؤول عن نموها من الطول، والموديلينج مسؤول عن تطورها من ناحية القطر. Let's talk in detail regarding these two osteogenics pathways. Now, in the intramembranous ossification, as we said, the mesenchymal cell, it's a group of cells that forming a cluster. Forming cluster group. This cluster group is called the primary, it's called ossification center. Okay, so the ossification center is building from osteoblast, and we have here another element which is called the osteoid. Now, once the osteoid enter this cluster, it is starting to converting the osteoblast to become an osteocyte. Once we osteocyte or mature bone cell have been formed, we have a trabecular matrix and the periosteum starting to develop. After that, we have the compact bone developing and the complete bone is ready. So, in simple, in the intermembranous mesenchymal cell develop directly to bone tissue, osteocyte then developing spongy and compact bone. بشكل بسيط زي ما حكينا الانترممبرانس هي عملية بحيث تتشكل فيها الميسنكايمال سيل، بتشكل إشي اسمه برايمري، مش برايمري، بتشكل اوسيفيكيشن سنتر. هذا مكون من أوستيوبلاست ومادة اسمها أوستويد. الأوستويد إذا أجمع الأوستيوبلاست بصير عندنا الأوستيوبلاست بتتشكل لأوستيوسايت، ولما تتشكل عندنا الأوستيوسايت ببلش ينتج عندنا يتطور عندنا الترابيكولا أو السبونجي بون، وبعد ما يتشكل عندنا السبونجي بون بتشكل عندنا طبقة الكومباكت بون. On the other hand, in the endochondral ossification, as we said, we have indirect process, which means the mesenchymal cell is developing to a chondrocyte. Now, the chondrocyte building what is called the perichondrion model. And this perichondrion model, once the capillary penetrates it, it's forming what is called the primary ossification center. And the bone is starting to develop. Now, the two ends continue to grow in two directions. And we continue, and the primary ossification center continue up to the age 18. Once you get 18 years old, we have another capillaries entering the two ends of the cartilaginous bone or cartilaginous part, and forming what is called the secondary ossification center. Secondary ossification center responsible to keep the cartilage only over the surface as articular for the articulation, المفاصل, and they converted the epiphyseal plate to become epiphyseal line, and the mature bone is now ready. زي ما حكينا الاندوكوندورال هي عملية بتطور فيها العظم بشكل غير مباشر من ميسنكايمال لغضروف. الغضروف بيبني نموذج، لما يدخل الدم لبداية النموذج الغضروفي بشكل عندنا البرايمري اوسيفيكيشن سنتر. الطرفين بيستمروا في النمو والعظم بيبلش ينمو من الوسط. بتضل هاي العملية حتى تبلغ العمر 18، بدخل الكابيلاري على النهايات الغضروفية وبشكل عندنا شيء اسمه secondary ossification center، بحيث انه بضل الغضروف فقط لا على السطح عشان المفاصل، والإبافيزال بليت هي اللي كانت تنمو العظمة، بتساعد على نمو العظمة من ناحية الطول، تصير إبافيزال لاين. Now let's talk in the next the fracture and bone repair. Now we have two things to talk. What is the fracture and what is the bone repair? Simply, the fracture is a broken bone, and we have here 8 classes of bone fracture. We have a closed fracture, which means that the bone have been broken down. However, the skin is still intact. Now, in the open fracture, we have one of the fracture side, it's breaking the skin and getting outside. In the transverse, it is the horizontal fracture, and we have a spiral, which is a twisting fracture, and we have here the comminuted, which means several breakings of several fracture at one side. And we have the impacted, one fragment is driven, one fragment side is driven into another, usually resulted from compression. And we have grain stick, which is a partial fracture, and we have oblique, which is a diagonal fracture. تمام؟ زي ما حكينا انه في عنا الكسور عدة انواع. عنا الكلوز انه بتنكسر العظمة بس ما بتأثر على الجلد وما بتطلع لبرا. اما الاوبن واحدة من العظمات اللي انكسرت بتطلع لبرا. الترانسفيرس وهو على الاكسس تبع العظمة. سبايرال ناتج عن الكسور اللي فيها التواءات. والكومينيوتد هي الكسور المتعددة بتتفتفت في مكان الكسر. والإمباكت إنه العظمة تدخل في عظمة تانية. والجرين ستيك هي جزئي. والأوبليك إنه بشكل طولي. Now let's talk about bone repair. We have four steps to bone repair. Which are the hematoma, then forming internal and external callus, then spongy bone, and compact bone. Now, when the bone breaks, the blood flows from any vessels that have been torn by the fracture. Tamam? And about 6 to 8 hours after the fracture, the clotting blood has formed a fracture hematoma. Now, after or within the 48 hours after the fracture, the chondrocytes from endosteum have penetrating the hematoma and developing what is called internal callus, whereas the chondrocyte from periosteum penetrating also the hematoma to forming the external callus. These external callus and internal callus started to be replaced by a spongy bone, which later on covered by compact bone, and the healing process is completed around 1 month of period. بشكل بسيط عملية جبر الكسور بتتم ب4 خطوات. أولها بنتج عنا الهيماتوما، وهي التخثر الدموي اللي بينتج عن تمزق الكابيلا الشرايين بسبب الكسر. بعديها تتخلل خلايا الكوندروسايت هذا الهيماتوما تدخل جواته. طبعا بتشكل نوعين من الكلس، واحد اسمه internal callus، واحد callus يعني كلس، external callus. هذول internal callus and external callus are very important to stabilize the fracture. كثير مهمات لتثبيت الكسر. بعدين الانترنال والاكسترنال كيلس ببلش يتم استبدالهم بسبونج بون، وبعد ما ينتج السبونج بون كالمعتاد بتشكل عندنا الكومباكت بون وبتتم عملية الجبر. Now the last section is talking about the exercise, nutrition, hormone and bone tissue. Let's start with the exercise and bone tissue. We have to know that the mechanical stress stimulate the deposition of minerals, salt and collagen fiber. Therefore, the lack of mechanical stress causes bones to lose mineral, salt and collagen fiber, and thus decreasing its strength. Example of that is the astronaut when they go to the space, because of the lacking of any gravity forces, so there are no mechanical stress over the astronaut bone, so they started to decrease their bone mass and strength regularly. Okay, يعني مثال على الاكسرسايز بون، حكينا إنه الميكانيكال ستريس يعني إنه العظمة تنضغط ويتحمل عليها أساسي في تثبيت المعادن والأملاح والكولاجين جواتها. وبالتالي عند تبعين الفضاء لما يطلعوا على الفضاء الخارجي لانعدام الجاذبية ما في وزن يتحمل على العظام، ولأنه ما في وزن يتحمل على العظمة ما في تثبيت للمعادن والأملاح جوا العظمة، وبالتالي بيؤدي إلى إيش؟ ليونة في العظمة. تمام؟ هسا in the nutrition and bone we do know that there are many of nutrition that affect our bone health. However, the most common and the most important nutrient that we need to our bone health, it is the calcium. Calcium simply could be found in the dairy or any type of milks. However, we have to know that calcium it's difficult to be absorbed in our small intestine, so we need the vitamin D, which helping the small intestine to absorbing the calcium. So vitamin D, as we said in the last chapter in the integumentary system, is essential to helping the small intestine to absorbing the calcium, and vitamin D is synthesized by our skin. Another important vitamin is vitamin K, which helping the small intestine again to absorbing the calcium. And we have magnesium and fluoride. Both of them are essential to build the frame of the bone or to build the internal structure of the bone. And we have the omega-3 fatty acid, which is reducing the inflammation and enhancing the osteoblast function. بملخص عندنا كثير من المعادن والفيتامينات الأساسية لتشكل العظم، أهمها وهو الكالسيوم الموجود في الحليب ومشتقاته، ولكن يجدى يعني لابد الإشارة إنه الكالسيوم صعب الامتصاص في الأمعاء الدقيقة، فإحنا بنحتاج فيتامين دي عشان يساعد الأمعاء الدقيقة في امتصاص الكالسيوم. أيضا فيتامين كي بيساعد على امتصاص الكالسيوم، وحكينا إنه فيتامين دي بيتم إنتاجه عن طريق إيش؟ السكين. هسا المغنيسيوم والفلورايد بشكله الهيكل الداخلي للعظم اللي بيجي عليه الفوسفور وبيجي عليه الكالسيوم عشان يبني عليه العظم. الأوميجا 3 بتساعد على إنها تقلل الالتهابات جوا العظم وبتساعد على تحفيز إنتاج العظم. Now for the hormone and bones, our endocrine system secrete several hormones, and many of these secreted hormones interact with our skeletal system. طبعا these hormones are involved in controlling the bone growth, maintaining the bone when it is formed, and responsible also for remodeling it. Now, as we said, several hormones are necessary, and an example of these hormones, it's a growth hormone. Now, growth hormone is very essential hormone for the bone growth because it increases the length of the bone and enhance the mineralization and improve the bone density. Another important hormone is the thyroxine, which again stimulates the bone growth and bone matrix. Now, 6 hormones are essential for a period of time. Now, the male 6 hormone it's called testosterone, whereas the female 6 hormone is called the estrogen. Now, these 2 hormones are very essential and very important to enhance the production of bone matrix and responsible for adolescent growth, and it's responsible to convert the epiphyseal plate to epiphyseal line. Now let's look for this graph. We could see how these 6 hormones acting. Now we would like to know that the bone growth increasing gradually from birth up to the age 30, where it is reaching the peak. Then after the age 30, it's becoming to decrease gradually. However, in the female, the decreasing is faster than in male, and especially after the age of 50, and this is due to the menopause, by which the estrogen level have been decreased, so the growing or maintaining of the bone decreased, and the female starting to lose the bone much faster than the male. طبعا three hormones also important for the bone is the calcitriol, which stimulates the absorption of the calcium and phosphate from digestive system. We have the parathyroid, which also have the same function of calcitriol, which helping the calcium and phosphate absorption in our small intestine, and also stimulate the osteoclast. Calcitonin, it is have opposite action of parathyroid and calcitriol, because it's inhibit the osteoclast activity and stimulate the calcium uptake. Now, due to imbalance in hormone or imbalance in nutrition uptake, we have to know the most common disease affecting the bone mass أو bone strength, which is called the osteoporosis, هشاشة العظام. طبعا osteoporosis is a disease characterized by decrease in the bone mass, either due to hormonal imbalance أو due to nutrition imbalance. بشكل بسيط عندنا عدة هرمونات أساسية في نمو العظم، منها هرمون النمو والثايروكسين الغدة الدرقية والهرمونات الجنسية. هذول كلياتهم أساسيات في نشأة العظم وتطوره خلال الفترة الأولى اللي هي ممتدة من الصغر حتى عمر الثلاثينات. طبعا بعد عمر الثلاثينات ببلش العظم يتناقص، عند الفيميل بتناقص بشكل كبير بعد عمر الخمسينات نتيجة انقطاع الدورة الشهرية وتأثر هرمون الاستروجين بهذا الانقطاع. طبعا في عنا هرمونين هم الكالسيترول والباراثايرويد، هذول أساسيات كمان وبيساعدوا في امتصاص الكالسيوم والفوسفات من الأمعاء الدقيقة، وبيساعدوا على تحفيز الأوستيوكلاست اللي هي مسؤولة على إنها تنظف الخلايا الميتة وتشكل العظم. الكالسيتونين هو بيشتغل عكس الباراثايرويد، بيثبط نشاط الأوستيوكلاست. وحكينا إنه أهم مرض بيأثر على البون ماس وهو هشاشة العظام وهو الأوستيوبوروسيس، ممكن يكون ناتج عن هرمونال imbalance أو nutrition imbalance. تمام. By this we reaching the end of this lecture, and hopefully you got an important and useful information, and I hope that this lecture was very clear, and see you in next presentation.